Hi, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening, and welcome to Sankofa Video Bookstore. And I hope everybody parked their canoes outside. We're so impressed that you made it tonight, and despite the weather, and sometimes because of the weather, because we all know rain is important. So thanks for joining us tonight. We're really happy to have a special guest, two special guests. And I'm very proud to say that one is my good friend, someone who I'm very proud to be associated with. My sister Linda here is, I'm sorry my back is to you guys. But I just want to say before I introduce them formally that Linda has been doing this research on midwifery and natural childbirth for years. And we came across each other early on. And someone who is a co-founder of this place, who's now gone on to the Ancestors, Salome Barima, who I think many of you know, was here at the time that Linda began, well, one of the iterations of her research journey into this topic, because she was making this an international network of understanding of the role of midwives and the importance of natural birth to healthy birthing, etc. So my sister Salome was very much involved in making sure that African culture was alive and passed on and not mowed down under an imperialistic machine which has happened over the centuries. So she was busy trying to cultivate remnants of African culture, particularly in her own personal experience in Ethiopia. And so we met with Linda, and I hope Linda will talk a little bit more about that. She met with some people in Ethiopia that Salome was able to put her in contact with as well in her research. And I just appreciate her work so much. And I'll give you the formal, if this mic goes out, put your finger up so I can stop talking to myself. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'll give you a formal introduction. Linda Holmes is an independent scholar, the former director of New Jersey's Office of Minority and Multicultural Health, and a women's health activist. Her writing, including articles in medical and feminist journals, has contributed to a resurgence of international recognition of the significance of African American midwifery practices. She is co-author with Margaret Charles Smith of Listen to Me Good, the story of an Alabama midwife, one of my favorite books. We have these up front, by the way. And she's also author of Joyous Revolt, Tony K. Bambara. This book we don't have on hand now, unfortunately. We're looking forward to it. We're looking forward to it coming out in paperback. But we've carried it before and also done an event with Linda here before. I definitely recommend that book as well. Tony Cade was had an amazing impact on Linda, somebody that she's grateful to in terms of her own journey and catapulting her into her journey. And she was writer and activist and co-editor with Cheryl Wells of Savoring the Salt, The Legacy of Tony K. Bambara. And she's living in Hampton, Virginia. Here is a copy of Savoring the Salt. Wonderful picture of Tony Cade. We also have that up front. And with us this evening is somebody I've been very pleased to meet. I didn't know we were neighbors. Right across the street, and that's not listed on here, by the way. Your Howard experience is not with us, and you're going to have to tell us more of that.
Okay.
This introduction does not include the Howard aspect of Rashonda Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is currently a fellow in maternal and fetal medicine at the University of Virginia. Not currently, and now she's currently with us, yay. And she's the recipient of the Peyton T. Taylor Scholarship, which funds research in the field of women's health, and her genuine interest in nutrition, obstetrics, and health disparities have fueled her current interest in diabetes, obesity, and pregnancy. And if you've been asked to be here with us today by Linda, I think that your relationship to midwifery, childbirth, the involvement of women in the birth of their children is going to be one of the most outstanding qualities that we're here to pay attention to today. So welcome to both of you. And with a round of applause, let's welcome our guests. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and I'm not sure that my microphone is picking up. It's fine. Okay. Sankofa is home in so many ways. It's the only place where, celebrating Tony K. Bambara, also here to celebrate and recognize Dr. John Hendrik Clark at one point, and now to be back home again, and also very, very grateful for Salame's support, particularly in Ethiopia, where I had an opportunity not to just interview midwives, but to talk with him about birthing justice movements on the continent, talking about developing birth centers, paying more attention to home birth and midwives. And I just want to say quickly, on my way here, we happened to have someone from Ethiopia as our Uber cab driver. And when I told him that I was going to be talking about midwives, his whole attitude changed, and he began telling the story about the midwife in Ethiopia who actually attended his birth and how much respect that he had for her in the community, and that she was the wise woman in the community. So more about that as we get into it. But I think maybe before I do that, I'm going to read a little bit from the book, but maybe just a little bit more about yourself. And yeah.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Rashonda Mitchell, and I am what you would consider, Western medicine. So I'm a maternal fetal medicine specialist, and I particularly specialize in complicated births and pregnancies. That's what I do. And we know with the current crisis that we are having, epidemic, pandemic, if you want to call it, in maternal health, it is very essential that we all play a role in birthing persons' lived experience. So I have always, since I was 16-year-old, wanted to do obstetrics. Had no clue about gynecology. And so throughout this whole journey to becoming maternal fetal medicine, I ended up right where I was supposed to be. And I have to tell you, today I had an epiphany moment because I'm actually still at work. Somebody's covering me right now. I've delivered 3 babies thus far. Today. And I still have 3 more to go to deliver. But I came here for this experience. Why not? And so I think it's so important because I find that a lot of people in our culture, to be honest, go to PWIs and other institutions, and we have an HBCU right here in our nation's capital, to me, which should be the center of Black maternal health, to be honest with you. Those with high risk births and low risk births, they should be able to come in and birth, and we should be the place for them to do that and have access to it, and we should celebrate it. And I will get more into that experience, but I went through fellowship and wanted to come back and return back to my roots. I did do fellowship here, and I know how much our community is in need here, and I felt like excellence should not exude or escape where we are, and it should come back home, and that's how I ended up back here at Howard.
Yeah, and I think that you should know the way that we met, right, was I was listening to the radio one Sunday morning, and it was midwives and doulas, and I'm thinking, I'm hearing a midwife speak, right? And it wasn't until further along in the conversation that I began to understand that in her heart, and I, from interviewing you, that she is a doctor who has really incorporated many of the ways of a midwife, right? And being concerned about the whole person, being concerned about the community, and so forth. But let me just read quickly from the book, and we're going to, these slides just to kind of give you an idea
of the places that I've been and some of the midwives that I talked to that will be running, at the beginning, and we'll probably show them again towards the end. And I have to put my glasses on because I'm not going to be able to. Okay, and I read in this because I was introduced as a scholar, but this book really comes from my personal experience, right? When I gave birth at St. Joseph's Hospital in Paterson, New Jersey in 1976, I had no idea that my childbirth experience would launch a lifetime of work. 45 years later, I remain committed to activism and write in support of a growing birthing justice movement that aims to end inequities in birthing care and outcomes. I dedicate all of the stories in this book to that movement. The fire I bring to this work still burns from my engagement in the 1960s Black student revolutionary movement. On the Rutgers University campus, I was among the Black students who raised our fists in making demands that challenged structural racism, the abysmal lack of Black faculty in classes, and classes focusing on Black history, which makes me think about the Supreme Court situation just a couple of days ago, and Black students' underrepresentation in the student population in that state-funded institution. Preparing to give birth 6 years later felt like readying myself for a Black Power march on campus. But this time, the demand centered on seizing the power to make choices about my own childbirth experience. To prepare for childbirth, my partner Welton Smith and I took classes with Elizabeth Bing, known as the Mother of Lamaze, in her apartment in Manhattan's Upper East Side. Smith, a journalist and a poet, was widely recognized for capturing the spirit of Malcolm X in his poem first published in Black Fire, edited by the revolutionary poet Amiri Baraka. As we prepared to give birth to our daughter, who is here, Andrew Agana Frisco Tashi Smith, we were the only Black couple in the Lamaze classes at that time, where we learned breathing techniques for relaxation, ways to negotiate having our partners in the delivery room, and how to avoid unnecessary drugs and technological interventions. Despite my preparation and determination to have my wishes respected, doctors administered Pitocin, a drug used to stimulate labor, and ordered an epidural, a procedure that injects a local anesthesia into the mother. And in an act, however, of self-empowerment, I refused to agree to an epidural unless my partner would be in the delivery room with me to provide support and to question the doctor. We also convinced the labor and delivery room nurses to agree to keep champagne chilled in the staff refrigerator for a celebration of Ghana's birth. That's when a nurse told me that I was the first in the hospital, this is 1976, to request rooming in with a newborn so that I could breastfeed my child on demand. After this birth experience, where I felt disempowered, I engaged as an activist who became part of a growing movement that focused on increasing access to birthing care that respected women's choices. Looking back, I can see now that my birthing experience more than 4 decades ago in a busy Paterson, New Jersey hospital with a doctor who I barely knew, was the beginning of a lifelong involvement in the birthing justice movement. Little did I know at that time, though, that my experience would drive me not just to learn more about the origins of alternative birthing methods and traditions here in the States, but that it would one day take me on this transatlantic journey to learn firsthand about birthing cultures on the continent from time immemorial, you all. Like, that's where it all comes from, right? From the continent. We are the first midwives. We are the first with birthing traditions. So we want this to be a conversation.
Yes.
So some thoughts about what I just read, maybe.
Yeah, so I mean, you said a lot of things that resonate with me. One, you felt empowered regarding your birthing experience, which I think is so important. You also advocated for yourself and your family to have your husband available to you during that time, which is something that I think is so essential to what we do. And I think that is so important. And I think you talked about the before the birth experience, how you went to Lamaze classes. And you hinted to it earlier. I think one of the things we have to get back to as a culture is actually thinking about the experience beyond just the baby and the birth. We have to think about mom. I think we have lost our sense of mom and mothering and preparing for the birth prior to, which leads to us not being prepared to handle some of the things afterwards. And so I think those are things that were steps that were so important, and it was a celebration. And oftentimes I can say in many of the situations on the clinical side, I don't always see that celebration portion. And the majority of it is because there are women that are coming in and they are birthing by themselves. And that's from families to partners. And so when I see that, I know that this experience for this woman has not been full. And that is the concerning part for me.
So it's interesting that you're saying that, because one of the things that I was struck by in collecting stories from midwives, not only on the continent, but in Alabama, where I interviewed midwives back in 1981. And that is how women gathered and created community for women, right,
Yes.
at the time of birth.
Yes.
And that the whole concept of birthing alone just didn't happen.
Right.
And that there was also this idea about celebration, right? And I know in Ethiopia, because that was some of the things that we were talking about when we had a chance to chat, that there was real live chanting and celebration around the time of birth, and that it was something that actually bonded community, right? That it made a woman feel that she was connected to her community during the time of birth. And there was one person that talked about the fact that at some point she felt like she was actually experiencing the birthing with her, so that there was this idea. But I'm trying to think now, how in the spaces that we have now, like I was talking about my own birth experience and how I had to fight to get the dad into the birthing space.
Right.
And even the birthing space itself, right?
Yeah.
You know, like we think about birth centers and those birthing spaces.
Yeah.
We think about on the continent, being outdoors, being close to earth, right? Having that kind of sense. So I'm trying to think about where you are now, women gathering, and how also, because you're a mom.
Yes.
So maybe some of that, your sensitivity also in terms of those ideas, yeah.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that about, your the different traditions that you see. And I think that's so important that we bring that up in culture, because I can tell you, DC is a wonderful melting pot, so we get to see birthing persons from all over the place. And so there is a large cultural difference when people come in and birth. And I can honestly say that when on any given day, I can have somebody from the continent of Africa, or I can have somebody who is Hispanic, and then I can have someone who is African American, all laboring at the same time. And the support system may look a lot different. Hispanic family, it's like 5 of them in the waiting room. They are rotating in and out. There are people there supporting this birthing person. Sometimes from, of course, the continent of Africa, mom is usually there somewhere, or mother-in-law is usually there. And the expectation is that after they birth, they're going to breastfeed. Now, some in the African American community, they come in and they have a support person, a partner with them, but usually it's individual. And of course, the way this society works, they may have to leave because of work and other requirements. So it does look a lot different. Yes, it does look a lot different in the different birthing spaces, and I think that was so important to me when I became a mom. And as she stated before, how she met me is that I was doing a radio show discussing maternal mortality as a physician, and I was pregnant at the time. And one of the conversations she said that struck her really, was that I said I had to have a conversation with my husband that if I became incapacitated and could not advocate for myself, he would be able to do that for me. Mm-hmm. And for us to sit and think that you have to think about your possible death in your child's birth was a real eye-opening experience. Mm. But I still needed him to advocate for me in that conversation. It was a conversation that you have to have that I don't feel like everyone has to have. And it kind of brought me to tears that I had to actually think about that moment while I chose to have birth. And sure enough, as fate would have it, I did have a complication. And my husband was shaken to his core. I was in the hospital for like a whole week. And sure enough, some of and I'm a professional who knows the background, who knows the medicine. And when I advocated for myself, I was told, "Oh, you just need to be the patient."
Okay, so let me just stop right there, because that is what really caused me to kind of think about the fact. So when I had my daughter, we were not married. Welton and I were really close, but to think about the fact that here is someone who is an osteopathic physician, who has a background in nutrition, right? Mm-hmm. Who had, she did her undergraduate work at this, did her some of her at Howard, came back to Howard, but there she is in Charlottesville.
Yes.
Where this is Thomas Jefferson, right? Going back where, Charlottesville had their first Black doctor, I think maybe in the 1960s, right? Mm-hmm. So, and one of the stories in the book is about Mrs. Thelma Jackson Price, right? Who gives birth in a tertiary hospital, supposedly the best hospital in Charlottesville, not that long ago, I think in the late 40s, early 50s, where she's giving birth in the basement of the hospital with water dripping down from the pipes, right? And not knowing who the doctor is that's going to attend her in childbirth, right? And she's doing this as a part of, which brings me to a whole nother thing, as a part of like the civil rights movement and wanting to have access to the quote white hospital and the quote prepared doctor, and that being angry, rightfully so, that not having the right to do that. Mm-hmm. But what really shook me when you told me that you as a physician, well qualified to participate in a discussion using the very terminology, right? So it's not like you have to, and we're talking about doulas trying to do this negotiation, but you yourself felt like you were not being respected as a Black woman, right? Mm-hmm. That you yourself felt like your peers were suddenly not your peers, yes. Right? That they were exhibiting that white supremacy, medical authority. Mm-hmm. So I'll let you kind of go back. But that really was.
I was literally, during the process I cried on the way to the OR because I didn't feel like I was heard. I did not want to have a C-section. I ended up having to have a C-section. And my thoughts, my decisions were not respected. And in that, I was very upset. But to minimize the scene that could have been had, I just relented for the well-being of my son and my husband, because he was concerned at that time, because he knew how upset I was to just go ahead and have a C-section. Yeah. It was not what I wanted to do, but I was told that if I didn't agree with the management, that I could find somebody else to tend to my delivery. because they were about to go. So that was one of the major things that I knew it was more of a systemic thing than it was an individual thing. And so when I attempt to provide care, I try to engage my patients. I inform them of risk and benefits because I have that knowledge to know and have seen some of the risk and benefits with my patients. And I do allow them to make an autonomous decision on their own. But they do have to assume whatever risk is associated with that. And I tell them that. But I think that was one of the things that really hit home for me. And it's funny we're having this conversation because I literally had an epiphany moment today. And I always ask, like, God, what is my talent? You know, everybody has talents. And I know I'm smart, but what is my talent? Like, I can't braid hair. I can't, I can't do all these wonderful things, sing. I don't have a body like Beyonce. So, like, what is my talent?
You are a beautiful Black woman.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I wondered, and as I was delivering those babies today, I said, this is my gift.
Yes.
And it hit me because I always believe that some people's career and their gift don't align. And I think I'm extremely blessed to know that my gift lines up with my actual career.
Yes.
And that means so much to me. And I actually, thank you. I can tell you, I love what I do. And like, I'm the person, my husband is like, are you coming home? I was like, but I have a patience to slavery. I think I might have to go back in. So he's constantly trying to get me home.
So, of course, I'm like really worried that will she make it here tonight, right? Because her call is not to be on a stage talking to a microphone. Her call is to be with the mom and with the baby. I just wanted to say something about this idea about this call that you have, because that is another thing I think that connects you with midwives. Because for them, it wasn't not just about the work or a job. It was, for many of them, a spiritual calling. They would talk about the fact that if they didn't do this midwife work, they wouldn't be well. In a very literal sense, that they would be mentally, physically sick. Because this was what the work that they were supposed to be doing. And it makes such a difference, right?
It does.
In terms of how you see, like you're not seeing your work as watching the clock or whatever, but in many of them they're doing God's work, And so that sense, and not only did folks have an opportunity to observe that kind of spiritual call in the birthing space, but because they were Black, because they were living in the community, because they were going to the same churches, because they knew each other's mamas and their grandmothers long, and a lot of that is in the book, that this is, they weren't seeing someone, and you weren't, I keep going back to that story, but these were your peers talking about you this way, but these were women that were respected, right? Because they knew them, they knew them.
Right.
Yeah, and I one of the wonderful questions that you asked when we talked is, what is it that physicians can learn from midwives, right? Because midwives are always, doctors are always thinking that we're going to teach midwives, right? That we're going to, there's All My Babies is a film that's shown quite often now, and you may have seen it, but All My Babies, when I was at the medical school in New Jersey, they would show it to the medical students as to teach them what not to do, which is, i.e., not to care, right? I mean, not to have this bond with the community. So many of the midwives in this book, one of the midwives set up a community center. One of the midwives was a teacher and a principal. One of the midwives was the director of the choir. So they had this whole person relationship. So how hard is it when you're in the space that you're in to kind of develop those kind of bonds? And how do you do that?
Well, for me, I think it's not hard for me because, like I said again, I think it's a gift. I actually am a consultant, so I don't tend to have my own patients. I usually consult patients that are complicated. There are a few that I will come in and definitely be there for the delivery. And so when I meet patients, I usually have to tell them I don't deliver, or I have to promise that I'm going to come in and deliver them, because I do establish it. I think it takes a skill, and I'm blessed to be able to have that skill and to really connect with my patients. And like a lot of patients will fight tooth and nail for me to be there at their birth. So it's one of those things, either you have it or you don't have it.
Yeah.
And what I really do is that when I meet patients, I try to understand them, understand their motivation, understand and be honest with them and build a relationship. It's about the relationship that you were discussing, and I think that's what's so important, because you trust people, that you have a relationship with me. And that's one of the things I do teach my residents. It's like, and I'll tell my patients, if you don't like me, that is A-okay with me. I want you to find a provider that you have a relationship with, because that's where you and the physician or your provider are going to get the best out of your relationship, because you're going to be honest with me and I can be honest with you, and we can help each other achieve what we set out to do with this, which is a healthy baby and a healthy mom. And so for me, I am very honest about those things, and it doesn't hurt my feelings, because I know I'm not everybody's cup of tea, and that is okay. But I want everyone to be able to build those relationships. And I know we talk about I think we do have one thing that we have to do in the midst of this crisis, this maternal mortality and morbidity crisis, is that we have to support each other as providers, as birth workers. And I think that is one of the biggest things that really hurts my soul, is because sometimes I see midwives, doulas, and physicians go back and forth with each other, and it really bothers me, because we are all there with the same goal, and we have to all figure out where we fit and where we play in that role. At Howard, we do have midwives that work on the floor 3 or 4 days a week. They usually bring their patients in at that time, and then patients will bring in their doulas, and they are allowed to go into the room and be part of the team. I know during the pandemic, it may have been a little different, but now doulas are allowed to be back in the room. And I think having that support system and everyone there is a wonderful thing. Like, I let a midwife, they're like, hey, the baby's breech. Do you want to do an ECV? She was like, okay, while you wait and go deliver that baby, I'm going to try to do my midwife thing and see if I can spin the baby before you get back. I was like, go ahead, do that. And if you don't spin the baby, then I'll come in and do the ECV. It's like a tag team. And that's what I want to see more in the community, is for us to like work together to help support these birthing peoples so that they can have the best outcome for them. And whatever a midwife can't do, I'm there to help out. You want a vaginal delivery, by all means. Somebody needs a C-section, I'll take them to the back, because I can do that. You know what I mean? And it's great. I just had a family medicine physician who works in the community. She brings her patients in. She can't do a C-section. Her patient was very sick. I let her go in. I let her go back with her patient because her patient wanted her there. I did the C-section. She came out and she was there during the entire time. So I think we have to start working together and supporting each other during this maternal morbidity and mortality crisis, so that we can help reduce some of this.
I'm going to just interfere just a second, because I know that you have some babies waiting on you.
Yeah, I do.
But I want to just have some questions before she leaves, and we won't feel quiet. She's going to be leaving in a minute, so I guess in about 10, 15 minutes. So let's get your questions in now, because I'm sure you have a zillion of them. If not, that I have. We started? Okay. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for what you do. I just wanted to, you said birthing people. I just would like to know if that is a directive from the higher ups. Are you changing your language in order to be more inclusive? Because, that's part of the whole birthing process as we move into the future.
So I do try to be as inclusive as possible when delivering my patients, because I do have patients who don't identify when they come in as female or male or whatever, and they would prefer they. And we make sure that we put that in their paperwork that they prefer they, and that we are going to respect that. Because for me, my concern is not what your pronouns are at the end of the day. My concern is your health and your baby's health. So if that is what you prefer, then that is what I will do. And that is what I have done. It's not really for higher ups. We try to respect cultural difference as well as personal differences. When patients come in, we have some women who are Muslim and they only want female providers so that they can take off their hijabs. And we try our best to accommodate those wishes. We have some women who have had traumatic experiences in their lives and they don't prefer male providers, or they want things done a certain way. I had one woman and her partner come in. They were a same-sex couple. They wanted music. They wanted to turn down the lights. I said, that's all fine as long as I can do what I need to do and there's no emergencies. I don't really care as long as it doesn't interfere with the care that I need to provide to make sure that you and baby are safe. So yes, I try to be inclusive and respect my patients. I don't really separate that because I think it's part of who they are. And if I have women and they want to be called women or whatever their name is, I respect that too.
Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I was actually speaking to my midwife, Marsha Jackson, earlier today, and she wanted to be here, but she's catching a baby. I spoke to Ms. Holmes when she first got here, and I was referencing Listen to Me Good, and you talked in the book about interviewing over 60 Black granny midwives in Alabama, and I thought those archives were in Alabama, but you said, can you speak about those archives? Sure. And then also I would love to hear the preservation of birthing traditions here in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, now that, you know, Marsha Jackson, one of the legends, is retiring, and thinking about all of that matrilineal memory and how we're going to preserve that going forward.
So I'm going to be brief in my response because I want to make sure that you have a chance to answer the second part of the question. I interviewed 50 traditional midwives in Alabama back in 1981, and all of those audio tapes are on deposit at Smith College as part of the Black Women's Health Project, and other archives related to the Black Women's Health Project are there. They will be accessible, I think, sometimes towards the end of this year, but there are transcripts, and I think that it's important to open it up. One of the issues that has slowed us down a little bit has been the issue of informed consent in terms of opening up opening up the transcripts, and I think it's important to honor the families. So we're trying to reach out to all the families to make sure that we have full consent, because we know about those abuses that have occurred in the past where people come in, they record someone's voice, and then the family doesn't know about it until some other time. But I want to make sure that you get a chance to respond to the second part of the question.
Yeah, I think we are now moving back to more traditional, like birthing positions and birthing experiences in the obstetrics community. I think now moving forward, we have identified and we know some of the mistreatment and misuses of the Black body. And I think with the Anarcha movement and the Betsy movement, where they've identified how there were slaves that were really mistreated and utilized in the development of the field of obstetrics and gynecology, people have really started to look more into basically how Black culture in and of itself has contributed to the birth of this nation. Unfortunately, I hate to use that term, but I think books such as Ms. Linda Holmes' book is actually one of the ways that we can actually preserve some of those traditions. And I'm so glad that she has done a lot of this research in literature. And I think now including and welcoming midwives into the birthing process has also helped as well. You may not be a big medical person that reads journals, but they did a research study on the birthing balls and the birthing peanut balls that people use during their birthing process. And they actually found that the birthing balls, the ones that people like to bounce on, was shown to decrease pain experience during the first stage of labor, and that the peanut ball that people have does decrease the amount of time in the first stage of labor. So they are starting to explore more options and incorporate those into the medical field, because we do know that they can help. I mean, although people may not utilize them all the time, we have the balls, we have the peanuts, we have the birthing bars at Howard. You just have to ask for them. We have all of those things, the handles. And I have caught a baby on hands and knees. As long as you have an epidural and I can catch that baby, we can do that too. Like, I am all for it. I think, COVID may have hindered some of our progress in this space because we had to be restricted to the rooms and masks and all of that now. But I think now going back to like walking and everything while you're in labor, I think the field of obstetrics and gynecology is really moving back to some of the basics of childbirth. So I think we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, because I think that they seem to understand that these are the ways of traditional midwives in the United States and on the continent since the beginning of time. Alternative birthing positions, not lying flat on your back to give birth, but using the stooping position, right? Massage. Those women, there have been studies done, their ability to prevent cesarean sections by being able to rotate the baby in uterus, right? And the disturbing thing to me is it's called How Do We Know What We Know? So for the medical world, we don't know it until some white men come together, right, and do a scientific study in the Western model, right? And then it becomes acceptable or usable. Whereas when the midwives in Alabama tell me, or the midwives in Ethiopia tell me, we've been doing this since the beginning of time, we know how to do this since the beginning of time, and the testimonies are, like they said in Alabama, we got here because of midwives, right? And even these studies, there's one wonderful study that was done by the Center for Disease Control in North Carolina back in the 80s or sometime, but they found that midwives who had traditional granny midwives outcomes compared to the outcomes of doctors trained in medical school when they had equity in terms of access to prenatal care, that actually these Black women had slightly better outcomes than the doctors, right? And those are the studies that they don't want us to know about. But we also have to accept those truths when they come from us. That we have to say, when we hear this truth tonight, when we see the stories like we were talking about from the Alabama women, and the stories in this book that are not being presented in the medical model, but as stories, truth, that is a model that we can accept and adopt as a way of knowing with confidence. But I do want to ask you about nurse midwife programs at Howard, because Howard did have a nurse midwife program at one time. Do you think there's any hope for that?
We do not, let me be very frank, we currently do not have a nursing midwife program at Howard. We don't have a doula program at Howard. But I think one of my first goals would actually be to actually start, if I can have the time, and the support of the community and money and dollars, because it takes money. Let's not forget about that, to train people, is to actually have a doula program or a midwife program at Howard. I think it would be remarkable and complement what we do. And I tell people all the time, don't let things fool you. I know, we at Howard have a different perspective with the maternal morbidity and mortality. I can tell you, because we have people who sit on the board at Howard, in the city, who does the review for the maternal morbidity and mortality. I have been at Howard for 2 years, and I have not seen one death of a mother. Now, babies, they do come in for different various reasons. Sometimes they are fetal demises before they arrive, but I think it's not as many in the city not city, I guess in the city of DC, we don't have as high of a mortality rate. Morbidity rate, I will say, is very, very high just because of the population. And one of the things in my last plug, because this is gonna come from my nutrition background, is that I think as a culture, we have to take better care of ourselves going into pregnancy, because a lot of things that we expect are the outcomes we expect are the outcomes they have for healthy women. I can't tell you right now how many people I see that are 23, 24 with chronic hypertension and diabetes going into pregnancy. So you are already putting yourself at risk on the other side, because pregnancy is beautiful, but it is a change in the physiology of your body. And you have to respect that. At the same time, we have to respect our bodies, I think, a lot better going into that portion of pregnancy, because we are birthing a baby. We are nurturing babies. And I will give another plug, is that we are now learning more in science that the in utero environment plays such an essential role of health and disease after birth. So what the baby is exposed to in utero affects how the baby's health on the outside. I can tell you probably in the next 20 years, we're going to know a lot more about that than what we do now. And so that goes back to the beginning of, we must be healthy first before we go into pregnancy. So you can't come in with diabetes uncontrolled or hypertension and expect to have a glorious birth out in the wild, and possibly not, and have minimal risk. There risk, and I hope that you do have a wonderful birth that has low intervention for everyone. But if you can't come in with that expectation, and I think that is one of the biggest things that I would like to say, because I know, because I have my master's in clinical nutrition, that what you put in your body is essential to how you feel and how you become and who you become. And I was very intentional about what I put in my body when I was pregnant, even before, because I knew I would be having a child later in life. So I wanted to be in tip-top shape because I already knew I had a couple of things not working in my corner at that time. So yes, I think obstetrics now is definitely moving to more traditional things, but I think also as a culture we have to take it in the responsibility of caring for ourselves before and after, and that means as a culture, because both of my parents are deceased, and I will tell you, having a child on your own without having the support of your family has been one of the hardest things that I can do. So I empathize with a lot of my mothers who have to go to work, 4 and 6 months, weeks after they give birth, and not having the support of someone there to nurture your child in a trusting way, and having to put your child in daycare. I was horrified because I had my son in November of 2019, and the pandemic hit in March of 2013. And 2020, and I had to go back to work. And I was like, I don't want to put him in daycare. Do I go back to work? It was a big decision. So I couldn't imagine what women, who do this have to think about on a regular basis. And that goes back to that community of women that you need to have before the pregnancy that are going to support you after the pregnancy. And I didn't have that. And I know there's moms out there with 3 or 4 children that probably feel the same way, and it is overwhelming and it is hard to do. So I just want to encourage everyone to one, enjoy this book because it is amazing, and I think it has a lot of traditions in it that we need to get back to, and support a birthing person if you see them.
Yes, thank you. I just want to say, it was so hard for Rashonda to negotiate, because you see where her priority is. But I just want to thank you again for taking the time, and also just for reminding me and everyone here that we have to be responsible for ourselves. I mean, if we don't know anything else about living in the United States, if we wait for the white medical system, we wait for doctors, and we are going to have to take the responsibility. And I think your last comments are so relevant. And that's what Black midwives did, right?
Yeah.
They said, we're going to take responsibility for our health and well-being.
In our community.
In our community.
In our community,
So
because at the end of the day, it's our community.
thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming over. So wonderful to know that you are our neighbor, that you're here with us, that you're a wonderful young lady. We just appreciate what you bring to our community, and thanks for bringing Howard and giving us another perspective about Howard, because we don't always hear that much. You know, what we hear about Howard is not always great.
Oh, there, wait, I know.
So we want you to shape up the place.
Yes, that's what I'm working on. It's a process.
Okay, and are you running now? Are you gonna stay with us a little bit longer?
It's 8 o'clock, I probably got 5 more minutes.
So,
and then-
okay,
Yeah,
so
I
you
have
have time
5 more
for more?
minutes, yeah, because I
Okay.
left a little late.
Okay. Rafa, who gets the next okay.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mick and I actually live in Baltimore, but I'm a community doula and lactation specialist, all the things. Also an anthropologist, ethnographer, so. And I'm Ethiopian. I did my research in Ethiopia with Ethiopian women. I cannot wait to read your book. I'm gonna cry through the whole thing. I'm planning on starting midwifery school next year. I'm going the CPM route, and I would just love to hear your thoughts about the lack of birth centers. As a doula, I did my first birth center birth, and I was like, why do we go to hospitals? Like, I don't, it was beautiful. We had a Black midwife, a Black birthing person, and everything. And so, what do you think are some of the barriers to starting and having more birthing centers in this area?
One is, I think access to medical care for people of color, uninsured or underinsured, is very difficult to have. And to be frankly honest with you, some women who probably could do that can't afford to do it because it is not covered. Some of it may not be covered by insurance. So you have to have money to do certain things. And so I almost feel like a lot of the luxuries that people with money have are not offered and available to all birthing persons. Two, I'm gonna see how I'm gonna say this. So I think access to healthcare is one, and finding the space to do it is another. And you do need money to do these things. So you need money and support to be able to keep the doors open, keep the lights on, and keep those things. I always encourage people to definitely stay in contact or have access to a hospital, because although birth is wonderful, if there is an emergency, I like for people to have access to what they need, because the very thing that you want them to be successful, and you don't want a poor outcome either. So I think location is important, and access to funds to be able to do that is important. And so probably some of the barriers are money, politics, and location, which is pretty much everything that we have. And I think, yes, I think people should have a right to birth wherever they choose, but also in the event of an emergency, have access to the care that they need, and be the right candidate to be able to do that. Okay?
And I think also with birth centers, the issue of insurance coverage for a birth center birth has been a barrier for many women, so that it tends to be women who can afford to pay out of pocket for a birthing center birth is another issue. Because for the most part, up until recently, most of the birth centers were serving white women in white communities. But I'm optimistic, though, about the presence of birth centers in Black communities increasing. And I think a lot of women who are not comfortable with a home birth find a birth center that can be more than a birth center, right? It can be a community center where doulas can talk with their clients or mothers and families and become a resource. I think it was in Cuba, there was a study that was done by the American Public Health Association that looked at the fact that the birth center would have an open door 24 hours a day, and that a pregnant woman did not need to be going into labor, but she could just come to the birth center as a place where if things weren't going well at home, as a way to reduce stress, and it was a safe place in the community, then the doors were always open. So I think we need to think more about how birth centers that are neighborhood based can have nutritionists and be a very holistic place. But I also recognize, and it's a very controversial thing because we're staying away from it, but there's a lot going on in terms of the different kinds of midwives and different approaches. And so I appreciate also you pointing out the importance of being careful to have a backup in case something else occurs.
And she said what I really wanted to say. It's really insurance. So people with money or that can pay cash are usually the one that have access to these experiences. And I think that's unfair. It's just like for me, I think I breastfed my son for a whole year. And one of the things that helped me is that I had the portable breast pumps that I could put in my shirt and wear and work, right? Now that is a luxury for people to have. But how many women who have to go back to work at 4 to 6 weeks would be able to benefit from being able to nurture their children with breast milk if they had access? Because most of the time their jobs are not going to let them excuse them for 30 minutes or for an hour to go pump for their baby and then store it. Where if you had the portable ones like I had, I just excuse myself for 5 minutes, go pop them in, and then they cut off automatically when they're full, which is great. And then you just take the bags out and throw them in the refrigerator. It's easy, it's simple, but I'm thinking how many moms that could, if they could afford it, would benefit, and how many children and families would be able to benefit from it. So it's really about having the money to be able to support those types of experiences, unfortunately.
Good evening, Dr. Mitchell, Linda. I'm Tammy Henry. I am a proud graduate of Howard University, and I'm super excited about what you're going to do for us. We're also friends of Joelle Royal, who tried to connect me with you 1,000 years ago. Linda's my mentor. We're both from Jersey. So what I would like to see happen is this paradigm shift around how Black women, particularly those who are educated, I'm a professor at GW in the School of Public Health, treat institutions that are historically Black. All of my doctors come from Howard University, right? But the narrative is such that fibroid surgery, endometriosis, whatever you got, don't go to Howard. And I am so concerned about that paradigm and the fact that people don't want to say it, but we live in a world where the white man's life is always colder, better, tastes nicer, fresher. And that is a lot of the reason that people kind of give me the side eye when I'm like, no, I go to Howard for everything. And they're like, what? But you have good insurance, you work at a great place. So I think that is part of the challenge that we have as persons who are emerging professionals, as persons who have achieved a lot of things that other people haven't, is reframing that narrative about what for us, by us really looks like, what Black excellence really looks like, and how we come together as individuals to make what you said happen. I feel like I know enough people that if you want the grants and you want to start a midwifery school at Howard, we can do that. That's what we do.
Yes.
However, getting the buy-in from other people that believe that excellence comes out of that institution is a very, very difficult task and will take a lot of selling across the board. So I'd be interested in speaking with you further. I know how to get in touch with you, but I do think that narrative and that reframing of the narrative is especially important when we talk about Black women of all means dying in childbirth. Thank you.
And we're going to I think we're going to let you go back to do what you
Okay.
love, but please respond
Okay,
to this last
this is the
comment.
last one, and I'm so glad you brought that up. I don't like to say it, but I'm glad you brought it up and you said it. So it's different for us at Howard because we're like, what do you mean people didn't respect you or whatever? Because like we try to do that with everyone that comes in there, especially, unfortunately, what people don't understand is Howard University Hospital takes care of the community, those that are uninsured, all day, every day. When I walk in that hospital at 7 o'clock in the morning, a lot of homeless people are asleep in the emergency room, and they allow them to sleep there overnight. And then they put them out, of course, in the morning so that they will have a safe place. Okay? Now, that is what we do. So a lot of people don't know 90% of the patients that we take care of, they are Medicaid patients. So that means that when it comes to being recouped for our money, we are getting the minimum if we do. And we do take care of people who don't have any insurance. I had a woman who walked from Panama to Arizona, and the governor of Arizona put her on the bus and shipped her here. Okay? She escaped Angola and got on a plane from Angola and then flew to Panama. And you could see the scratches on her legs when she came. And she didn't really want to talk about her journey of how she got from Panama to Arizona. And then in Arizona, she didn't have money to get on the bus to go anywhere. And they put her on that bus where they shipped them to DC and dropped them off trying to be funny in politics. And the first place she came was Howard University. And you know what my nurses did? They brought her and her daughter clothes. We kept her there. Her baby was severely growth restricted because she hadn't eaten in over a month because she left I'll never forget, she said April 27th is when I left Angola. And I've been traveling ever since then, and I took care of her at the beginning of June. So for about a month and a half, her and her daughter have been walking and trying to find refuge. And she was afraid that she was admitted to the hospital that her 12-year-old daughter wouldn't be able to stay with her and she would go to the system. And we allowed her daughter to stay in the hospital with her so that she would not lose her child to the system because she had no one else here. And we took care of her. We had her baby's still in the NICU, and we take care of them. But we take care of those that are underinsured. So you're right, we can't afford the big fancy things that a lot of these other hospitals have because we're not getting paid top dollar for the care that we provide. So I like the fact that you want to change the narrative, and that's what I'm trying to get people to see, is because we don't always at Howard see that dynamic, that power struggle as much as you would see in another. I'm not saying we're exempt from it, because one thing I'd like to say is all Black people are not the same, okay? So, and that's different. We are from different diasporas. So I have nurses from all over the continent of Africa. I'm talking about Ethiopian, I have Nigerian, I have Guyanan. All my nurses are from all over the place. I have doctors that are Canadian, that are Jamaican. They are from all over the place. So we all bring our own cultural differences into that. So there are some dynamics and power shifts with that. But at the same time, we are focused on the end goal, and is that for you to have a happy, healthy baby, because we're all trying to survive. We're not trying to contribute to the demise of our own. We're trying to build people up. So I think that narrative is there. And I had a patient come in about 2 weeks ago. She said, we should have listened to you. Told me to come. You said I was having these issues. I should have came right to labor and delivery, and I needed to have a C-section. She said I didn't listen, and I went to Anne Arundel County. And guess what happened? I had a C-section. I was like, yeah. So she thought that she was going to a different place, going to get a different story, and end up in a different type of thing. So I think, yes, you should give Howard a chance. We are moving forward. We haven't arrived yet, but we are trying to change the narrative and continue to provide awesome care.
Thank you so much again. Could I just say one thing?
Yeah, 'cause this is really, then we're gonna close, right? And say,
No, we're not gonna close unless you're in a hurry, because we have a lot of questions about your book.
Okay, so I was just gonna say, this idea.
Sorry, I have the key to the door.
Okay, this idea about trusting ourselves, right, that you're talking about, it's the same story with midwives. It was the same point that we weren't trusting midwives, that we felt that we couldn't trust what was Black in our community as a caregiver. So, this is a woman we can trust, and she works at Howard University.
Thanks, everybody.
Tell me all the clothes.
I'll be in touch. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Off I go.
Okay.
I'll be instructed.
I want to make this transition if it's okay. Can I sit with you?
Yes.
Yeah. I'd like to make this transition to something that fascinates me about your work, and that is the way you integrate, two parts. What did you see that sort of flowed through the various traditions that you were able to document? That's one part, and the other part has to do with ancestors and how you saw that sort of flowing into these traditions. Is that too broad?
No, it's not too broad. I was just, it's been a very full evening, right? And the questions have been wonderful. And this was our first time meeting, so it was somewhat emotional for me because we've been on the phone so much. So the traditions, some of them are what we now call like the best practices, and there are definitely lots of similarities. I was in Ghana, I was in Ethiopia, and I was in Kenya. So among the traditions that were present in all three places, and of course there's various cultures within those countries, but one of them was, as I mentioned earlier, was massage. Massage was at the core of the practices everywhere that I talked to midwives. And massage was used not only during the prenatal period to determine whether or not the mom was pregnant in the first place, right? And to determine how pregnant she might be, not in terms of months, but just, we're so specific about calendar, but it's just a whole different way of seeing time. Like, early, you still have lots of time left. Let's talk about the vegetables that you need to eat, the grains and so forth. That was one phase, early stage of massage. And then the other time would be approaching birth. And when they were seeing the mother, throughout the pregnancy, and they were massaging the mother to see the position of where the baby actually was. And if there was concern towards the end of the pregnancy, the skills that these women had to be able to turn the baby were so recognized in Kenya that they were like front page newspaper articles in the mainstream press about particular Black women who actually had relationships with hospitals, and they were actually, turning babies, and these were skills that the doctors did not have. There was a midwife in Kenya who would be called in, this is recent years, again, to prevent the cesarean section, to do the massaging needed to turn the baby. So that I also learned about in Alabama. That the women in Alabama, who are in the book as well, talk about massage also being something as a time of a very spiritual moment. So, humming or singing or going to that space where they're connecting with their spirit, their God, or however they call that spirit. But that was a time that it was technical, but it was also very, very spiritual. And there's a second part to your question.
Well, I think you've kind of pulled it in. So that's an African tradition that you also found in places like Alabama. And then the ancestral part, you mentioned ancestors in your work.
Yeah. So to me, one of the real, tragedies in terms of knowing the value of the Black women in our community is to understand that practices that were being dismissed as being superstitious, as being backwards, as being a sign of ignorance, were actually practices that had to do with having herbal knowledge, which had to do with hand skills, which had to do with being able to attend multiple births, which had to do with centering, burial of the afterbirth is another one that's really strong, really strong. When I was in Ghana, they finally convinced, now everywhere there's kind of this Western medicine influence, right, including on the continent. So they had come up with this rule that mothers, that the placenta would remain at the facility. They call it we say hospitals, they say, I like the word facility better. But at the facility, that they would not be able to take the placenta, the afterbirth, home. And the villages were really, in terms of the ancestral practice, they were really like, we're not going to have our babies in the facility if we cannot bring the afterbirth home. And so the afterbirth was buried. But this, in Alabama in 1981, I interviewed several midwives who talked about the importance of burying the afterbirth, and that it was a part of their practice. And so what was being dismissed by some as superstition is African traditions, and that Black midwives kept alive African traditions that were from the time, those of us who came through the Middle Passage, passed on to their daughters, to their daughters, to their daughters. And unfortunately, when I was doing the interviews in 1981, they would say things like, well, I'm not sure where it comes from, but my mother told me I had to do this, or my grandmother told me I had to do this. I mean, you would rarely hear someone say, or they would say, we've been doing this, my great-great-grandmother who was enslaved did this, right? And then she passed it on. So it became very clear to me, and that's what led me to go to the continent, because I started realizing 4 generations back, these women were able to continue traditions that were threatened by enslavement, that were threatened by doctors trying to do away with their practices. And even when they came up with these rules, like they did in Ghana recently, that you can't take the afterbirth and bury the afterbirth, the midwives defied the rules. They were like, they don't know what we're doing when we come back to our communities. They're at the health department in town somewhere, that we can continue the traditions that really mean the most to us when we are on our home base in our communities, and making our black pepper tea or our ginger tea to encourage. And there was this respect. It wasn't like they said, this comes from Africa. They say, this comes from my mama, this comes from my grandmama, this comes from my great-grandmama. And then being able to go to the continent and hear them say, this comes from my mama, this comes from my great-grandmama, but also to connect it with their own traditional, spiritual, religious practices. So that's the difference, whereas in the South it was coped in the language of Jesus and Christianity, but there, whether it was Muslim or traditional African religions, they would be able to put it in that context.
Do we have more questions before I continue with mine? Just in the back. So what fascinates me about your work is how you that firsthand access that you have to people who are working as professional in the sense of being community created and shaped, people that are organically coming out of a community and continuing, learning a skill and continuing that skill, and then you having this kind of access to them. And I just wonder how that went. Did you have to make yourself known first? Did they trust you? Did they think that, did they embrace you? I'm sure this was different in the different locations, but how were you sort of accepted as this person from the outside?
Yeah. Well, I kind of talked about it first in Alabama because that was 1981. So I was really worried. I was coming from New Jersey. They didn't know my mama. I wasn't from their village. And only in Selma, Alabama did I have some folks that were able to say, oh, Linda's okay. She's been to the house. She's a friend of my daughter and all that. But what I found in 1981 is that the midwives themselves had just been dismantled brutally without any respect or recognition of their work. they were sent letters in the mail. Some of them were a white nurse would knock on their door and say, "You're done." And their mother was a midwife, their grandmother was a midwife. And so that was in the 1978, I think they passed the law that literally eliminated midwife practices. And all of the midwives on the final list, or the only list that was done, was like over 100 midwives at that time. At one point, it was like in the 50s, it was like thousands still in Alabama. There was one white midwife on the list. But when I went to Alabama and talked to midwives, they were so pleased that somebody was interested in their story, because they were being told, we don't need midwives anymore, that it's not safe for the mother, it's not safe for the babies, and so that this generations of traditions were just literally being thrown out the window. So I was surprised, quite frankly, that I could literally, most women had phones, but there were some women who didn't have phones, that I could kind of knock on a door and say, is it okay for us to talk? Which is one of the reasons why, with this thing with Smith College, I just feel that they trusted me. And my daughter and I've talked about this a lot, right? So that when I'm opening, I've had a lot of about opening it up in terms of not knowing who's going to have access. But we've worked on that. Like, people are going to have to contact me and so forth before they would have access. But they were really wanting to tell their stories. And they wanted others to know their stories. And that's why I'm comfortable with the book. Because they had been, by mainstream media, yes, but in their communities, though, they were celebrated. The historically black newspapers, if you're interested in learning more about midwives, if you go to historically, you'll see the stories of midwives. Now, on the continent, I was really worried. I don't speak the language, right? And I was telling the cab driver who brought us over here from Uber that one of the beautiful things about Ethiopia was the sense of being black. And I didn't expect it, but literally the children would come up to me. We didn't speak the same language, and they would say, "Black, you're black, I'm black, we are black," right? And that was the sense I had also in talking to the midwives. And when I went there, I didn't say that I'm an anthropologist, because I'm not. I didn't say that I'm doing a study, because I'm not. I said that I am a mother, I am a grandmother, and that my ancestors are from the continent. And there's this, I'm sure others have experienced this rejoicing of this idea that the ability to return, right? Because in some ways it was unimaginable that we would be able to come back. So there's this sense of, the other thing I said was, I'm not just here to talk to you about your midwife work, but is there anything that you want to discuss about what's going on now in terms of the birthing facilities, in terms of how midwives are being treated, that I will include that also in the work that I'm doing, and make sure to let the health departments know and so forth about your concerns. And so, there's this sense, but even before I got to all that, it was just the joy, again, similar to the midwives, and it's the joy that I have come all this way to hear their stories when other people are, and is this happening on the continent now, similar, that the traditional birth attendants are being told, well, you need to get some training, you need to do it the more modern way, but I'm saying, no, I respect what you do, I value what you do, and what you're doing was continued by my ancestors because we are descendants of the same ancestors.
While you were there, did you tell them the stories of the granny midwives that you interviewed? And how did they, if you did tell them, what was their reactions to know that through the Middle Passage, that the traditions that started on the continent survived even to this day? Like, how did they feel about knowing that as well?
Well, so the first part of the answer to that is that at one point I was getting really disturbed about what was going on with the training with the midwives, and I started, this is starting all over again, like what we experience in the United States, they're getting more medicalized and all of that. So I was really worried about that. And one of the things that happened, I was talking to someone who's really doing a lot of research in Ghana about herbal traditional medicines, supported by the University of Ghana, on really, really important work. And I said, this is really scary. What's going on? And he said, wait a minute, didn't you just tell me that midwives in the United States somehow managed through the Middle Passage, through enslavement, through whatever, to keep these practices alive? So I think the midwives, that when I told them that there were midwives in Alabama that were continuing, it was like a time of rejoicing in a sense. And when I was in Ghana and I thought about the afterbirth being buried under the ground that I was standing on, because I watched them prepare, it's like almost like a ceremonial kind of thing. And I realized I could be standing on an afterbirth in that soil of my ancestors. And this whole idea of seeing the afterbirth as part of life, and that these women in Alabama continue to do that. But I think the other thing is the total, there's no way to know this, right? So to hear this in my story to them, I think may have been what helped to open the door to them willing to trust me, because that would be, and the other thing I think too is that what we're really good at as Black people, because we've been so faced with all kinds of crap, that we're pretty good at reading people. So I know that there were times that, that happened, I felt it really in Alabama too, that sometimes they would just like, I would have to center myself before I went into the space. Like I would have to go into meditation because it's like reading me, right? That I know that these particularly older women are very good at looking beneath my skin, my Black skin, to try to assess my spirit. And so that I was very grateful, but I had to be very mindful of respecting them and mindful of understanding that what they've been doing all of these centuries, be it this passing on from ancestors, that we're able to continue this because it's been passed on. But the women were very, very good at making sure that I stayed centered in myself even before I got out of the van or the car that I was in.
Just to raise your hand if you have a question. Did I see one in the back from someone who didn't? Okay, here you go.
Oh, I had one. I had a question. Ms. Holmes, I want to go back to Listen to Me Good, and when we talk about how white domination eviscerated traditional Black midwifery in Alabama, with Margaret Charles Smith, in the book you discussed how after they stripped her of her livelihood, she had to become a domestic worker. When you interviewed some of the other traditional midwives, what did life look like after that assault by white domination on traditional midwifery?
So one of the things that I did ask was, have you considered practicing underground? And so these were Black women who were older for the most part and had seen the worst of, not the worst because it's still going on, the different expressions of white supremacy, were just said, we don't want to go to jail, right? Period. They were older and they knew that they would not be, unlike the white women who were practicing, quote, underground and were not arrested, right? And even now, I just got a call from the, what is it, the lawyers group that represents, one of the major lawyers organizations about what's going on in Florida in terms of Black birthing centers and Black midwives being assaulted. Yeah, something like that. But that wanting to know more about what midwives in Alabama were saying, because they're not being treated the same way as the white midwives who are doing home births and the white midwives who are doing birth center births. And so they pretty much accepted it. However, I was really, really felt defeated about the whole thing. And in some ways, this book has kind of, like, I'm feeling far more in the birthing justice movement than I did when I left Alabama, when I thought, oh, maybe this is the end. Clearly, it's not the end. But Annie Lee James said to me, what is wrong with you? Midwives have always been with us. And no matter what these men are trying to do to get rid of midwives, it ain't going to happen. The midwives are always going to be with us. And, I just said, oh, this is her Christianity way of thinking about the Old Testament and Moses and all that, But in fact, I am convinced that much of what is Black culture, which is African culture, whether it's midwifery expression, whether it's music, whether it's in the words, whether it's in respect for the ancestors, that we're going to keep that. Whether it's Sankofa bookstore, the spirit of our strength is incredible. And I think that's what drives the folks that are trying to destroy us crazy, because we keep rising up again.
In fact, we had someone asked if they could bury their child's placenta here at Cinco.
Here is an outdoors one. So
I mean,
well, the thing is, I guess the problem with that would be you might have a trail of people coming.
there's some issues that we just don't know how to handle those issues.
And also, I think you could say that that's not the tradition. I think you could also point out that the tradition is not to go find someplace. It's about keeping near the homestead, right? And it doesn't have to be in the ground. I mean, that's the other thing I think about traditions, that there are people that feel that the tradition has to be the puristic tradition from 10,000 years ago, or even like some of the African stuff we could say from 1,000,000 years ago. But, we can modify, we can consider where we live now in these urban communities and what makes sense.
And what home means.
And what home means.
That's how we survived so far, is redefining all of that.
Yes.
That's why I'm in such admiration of what you've done, because you defined what was important and you kind of went after it. I think sometimes we feel like there is so much loss in our culture that we focus on the loss. And, we feel like we have post-trauma PTSD. And we should get medicines for being depressed, and et cetera. But in fact, one of the best remedies for PTSD, I'm not a medical person, but I find, let's me say on a personal level, one of the best remedies for that kind of bad feeling for me is to figure out a way to resist. It's medicine. It's medicine. So the fact that you said, okay, what we've been told about our culture is not true. That, even if, the midwives in Alabama don't say a word about Africa, she makes Africa live. She's implementing Africa. And so for someone like you to go around and say, we're going to find out who these people are, we're going to appreciate them, we're going to pass this information on to our kids, is really, really, really important. And it may seem, like a small thing or a difficult thing. I know it took you. I don't know what the next leg of your journey is, Gandhi. You have to tell us where she's headed next. But, so far, the work that she's been doing, with excavating this information and tying it together has been so, so valuable. And I just want to say thank you very much for making sure this is a priority and defining it. How many of us can't even define what resistance is going to look like? We just get frustrated. What should I do? That's a very, very, very creative way to apply your sense and determination to make sure that Black people survive with dignity and fervor.
Thank you so much. That's why I love Sankofa. Sankofa is a healing place. The words here, the books here, you here, how here. I mean, it's just an incredible place. And the people who come here, right, for this conversation and this discussion. And I think that, this whole idea of not allowing ourselves to be defeated, period, just ain't gonna happen. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a very, very special moment. Very special. Thank you for the work.
We have one more question here. Is that fine with you?
This is the last one, I think.
Okay, last question.
All right.
I think you had the first one and the last one.
Yay. All right. I'm an element Pisces, so I open and close the circle. So, as you know, Black women have the highest mortality rate during childbirth in this country. Will having a midwife in the birthing process, during the birthing process, reduce that number? How do we get there? Should there be policy changes? Should we have insurance that allows that to happen so we can deliberately reduce those numbers, because anti-Black sentiments do feed into those numbers? And also, if you could talk about what you would like people to take away from this very important book.
I'm going to be very brief because I'm ready to maybe get some Ethiopian food from them. But I think that we are at a point, it's really important to understand that, and I think the doctor referred to it as well, that the whole issue of infant mortality is a very complicated issue, right? There are lots of things that lead to healthy outcomes. So you can have a wonderful midwife, right, and you can birth at a birthing center, but if you're not taking care of yourself or have challenges taking care of yourself, if you are dealing with the whole idea of this, the trauma of racism, the psychological issues, if you don't have a job, if you don't have an adequate income, and infant mortality often reflects a lot more than the actual childbirth experience. And those of us who do public health, we look at the infant mortality as kind of a measure of the overall well-being of the community. So that as Black folks, we're challenged on many levels, and if we think that if we fix the hospital situation that will solve the infant mortality issue, or even if we say if every mama has a midwife, then we're going to solve the problem, because that is one part of solving the problem. But where we live, who we're surrounded by, what we're eating, the issue of rest and restoration, all of those kinds of things, which is one of the things that I loved about the traditional midwives. They were all for that 6 to 8 weeks of rest and restoration following birth. And now that there was kind of that feminist thing about we're going to get up from super mama, we're going to go right back to work and all of that. But having those social supports, so it's complicated. And I think that as long as we keep in mind that it's complex, so that we don't say if we just have midwives and doulas and birth centers everywhere, everything will be solved, because there will still be women, as the doctor pointed out, who have complications that are best served in a hospital or medical setting if it is not polluted by the racism and the white supremacy and the ignoring our voices, whether we're a doctor or whether we're a working class person. It's complicated, but I'm optimistic that just the idea that we're now calling it a birthing justice movement, I think is really gives me a sense that that things are moving in the direction that they need to be moving in, and usually when that happens, we're faced with more challenges. So I think the fact that we have more midwives out there, more doulas out there, and that we're familiar with the birthing justice movement as a way to approach this problem does make me think that 10 years from now, they won't have killed us yet. Yeah. Oh, signing folks. Oh, if anyone, yes.
So thank you so much once again. I don't know if you want to take a couple of minutes to break and then start signing books.
Yeah, we just go over.
Yes. Okay, so if you want to purchase your book and then meet Miss Linda, as the doctor called you, I love the way that she incorporated, that was so sweet. Here to have your book signed, please meet us back here in 3 minutes.
Okay.